In the darkest years of the 20th century, a regime built on violence and ideology rose to power in Germany.
Ihr seid das schwarze Korn. Macht niemals eurem Ruf, den ihr erworben habt.
But behind the politics and propaganda, another obsession was quietly taking shape. An obsession with ancient relics, with lost civilizations, and the belief that the German people were heirs to a forgotten and powerful past. Expeditions were launched across the world, from the ruins of Europe to the remote monasteries of Tibet. But how did mysticism find its way into the heart of Nazi power? And how far were they willing to go in search of myth? Wewelsburg Castle, Westphalia. Heinrich Himmler stands in the North Tower, looking out across the low hills of Saxony. Below, the renovation crews work steadily. He climbs the narrow staircase in the circular tower and steps into the hall at its summit. A dark radial pattern is set into the center of the floor. From the edges of the chamber, 12 figures step forward out of the dim light. They wait. This is where the vision begins to take shape. Himmler's interest in the castle was tied to his belief that the surrounding region was the site where ancient Germanic tribes defeated Roman forces 2,000 years earlier. A symbolic victory he interpreted as proof of enduring Germanic strength. From this starting point, he became increasingly obsessed with Saxon history. In his view, Westphalia was part of the ancient Saxon lands. Land that had resisted Charlemagne's forced Christianization. In Himmler's interpretation, the Saxons represented an ancestral Germanic power, interrupted by foreign influence. He immersed himself in early medieval history, especially figures such as Henry the Fowler, the first Saxon king of East Francia, whom he saw as a model of renewal, a ruler who united a fragmented realm. He studied chronicles, commissioned research, and promoted narratives that cast the Saxon past as the foundation for a future Germanic order. The castle is to become a symbolic center for the SS leadership. A controlled environment where hierarchy, ritual, and ideology can be reinforced away from the public eye. The SS were founded in 1925 as a small unit assigned to protect Adolf Hitler at party rallies. It began as a bodyguard formation. Under Heinrich Himmler, appointed Reichsführer SS in 1929, it was transformed into something far more ambitious. A self-contained power structure built on racial doctrine, internal discipline, and bureaucratic control.
Wir sind Soldaten und wir sehen unsere Aufgabe darin, zu üben, Körper und Geist. Seid überzeugt, ein Volk ist so lange groß, als es treu ist. In dem Augenblick, wo die Völker und wo die Soldaten untreu werden, In dem Augenblick verlässt sie das Schicksal und in dem Augenblick stürzt sie hinab in den Abgrund.
Membership became deliberately restrictive and administratively rigorous. Applicants were required to provide proof of their ancestry, often tracing lineage back to 1800 through church registers and civil records. Genealogical charts were submitted to the SS Race and Settlement Main Office for verification. Prospective members underwent political vetting, criminal background investigations, and assessments of ideological reliability. The black uniform became a marker of belonging. The silver Totenkopf skull badge, inherited from older Prussian and imperial military units, was repurposed as an emblem of death, intimidation, and fanatical loyalty. The twin lightning bolt insignia, the SS runes, were designed by SS officer Walter Heck, drawing from the Sig runes of ancient Germanic alphabets. Under Himmler's direction, these angular symbols were presented as a visual link to the mythologized pre-Christian Germanic past. Himmler developed a personal fascination with Germanic runes as symbolic instruments of power. He studied the interpretations of early 20th century Volkisch writers who treated runes as carriers of hidden meaning rather than simple phonetic characters. He saw them as visual condensations of ideas: victory, loyalty, heritage, and strength. Runic symbols began appearing throughout SS culture. In unit insignia, ceremonial rings, architectural motifs, and internal publications. Himmler encouraged their use as a way of giving the organization a mythic vocabulary. The SS was portrayed not as a modern political police force, but as an order grounded in ancient tradition. Himmler's imagination draws heavily on myth and reconstructed history. He studies Arthurian legends and medieval epics, searching for structures that can be repurposed for a modern elite. Tales of the Round Table, particularly the Fellowship of Knights bound by loyalty to King Arthur, appealed to his desire for a disciplined inner circle, united by ritual, hierarchy, and shared mythic purpose. The circular hall in the North Tower echoes the image of a round table, a gathering of chosen knights bound by loyalty. He envisions his 12 senior SS leaders gathered there as a closed circle, bound by oath and lineage. He studies medieval knightly orders, particularly the Teutonic Knights, not as historical subjects, but as organizational models. The Teutonic Knights were a medieval Catholic military order founded at the end of the 12th century during the Crusades. Originally established to provide medical care and protection for German pilgrims in the Holy Land. Over time, they evolved into a powerful monastic military institution, combining the religious discipline of monks with the martial structure of a professional army. Governed by a strict hierarchy under a Grand Master, the order emphasized obedience, collective identity, and a clearly defined mission that blended spiritual purpose with territorial ambition. Himmler spoke of the SS as a brotherhood, meant to survive beyond the lives of the men within it. In his thinking, it would become the foundation of a new ruling class. A racially defined elite whose authority would be passed down across generations. But where did these ideas originate? And how did they come to dominate the thinking of a high-ranking Nazi official? By the late 19th century, Europe is changing faster than at any point in its history. A new industrial age is taking hold. Factories rise along rivers and rail lines. Railways carve through farmland and forest, binding distant regions into a single economic system. Electricity begins to illuminate city streets and power new industries. Scientific advances do more than improve technology. They begin to unsettle assumptions that had governed European thought for centuries. In Germany, as in much of Europe, traditional church attendance begins to decline in urban centers. Rural communities remain devout, but in cities, the authority of the church no longer feels absolute. Darwin's theory of evolution reframes human origins as biological development rather than divine creation. Geology stretches the age of the Earth far beyond the limits once accepted by Christian doctrine. Then comes rupture. After 4 years of brutal bloodshed in the First World War, Germany is defeated. The immense loss of life during the war left millions across Europe grieving fathers, sons, and brothers. In the wake of such devastation, many people turned towards alternative spiritual movements in search of comfort and answers. Spiritualism, which claimed the living could communicate with the spirits of the dead, experienced a surge in popularity during the years following the war. Among the most influential supporters was the author Arthur Conan Doyle, who became one of spiritualism's most passionate public defenders.
But it was only in the time of the war, when all these splendid young fellows were disappearing from our view, the whole world was saying, well, what's become of them? Where are they? What are they doing now? Have they dissipated into nothing? Or are they still the grand fellows that we used to know? It was only at that time that I realized the overpowering importance to the human race of knowing more about this matter.
Spiritualism spreads from Britain and the United States into continental Europe. Seances become fashionable. Mediums claim to communicate with the dead. Table turning and automatic writing enter middle-class parlors. In the German-speaking world, occult and esoteric societies multiply. Groups devoted to theosophy, Ariosophy, and Germanic mysticism attract followers seeking meaning outside institutional religion. Theosophy, founded by Helena Blavatsky, blends Eastern philosophy, Western esotericism, and the idea that hidden spiritual masters guide human evolution. Her writings circulate widely in translation. Ariosophy emerges as a racialized offshoot. Writers such as Guido von List and Jörg Lanz von Lebensfels combine runic symbolism, mythic history, and racial hierarchy. They argue that an ancient Aryan race once possessed superior spiritual and physical qualities, which were later corrupted through racial mixing and decline. These ideas capture the attention of Heinrich Himmler. Raised in a strict Catholic household in Munich, Heinrich Himmler grows up under the influence of his father, a disciplined schoolmaster who values order and obedience. As an altar boy, he becomes familiar with the church's structure and symbolism, absorbing its emphasis on discipline, purity, and spiritual duty. But as he grows older, Himmler begins to drift away from traditional Catholic belief. He searches for a structure that will embody his beliefs about German racial superiority. Himmler rises through the ranks of the Nazi Party until he finds himself in a position of influence within the SS. The organization provides him with something he had previously lacked: the authority and resources to pursue the ideas that increasingly occupy his attention. Himmler begins to cultivate relationships with writers and researchers who reinterpret medieval history and legend through the lens of racial theory. Among them is a young German scholar named Otto Rahn. Rahn is not a political figure, but a researcher drawn to the mysteries of the Middle Ages. He becomes fascinated with the history of the Cathars, a Christian sect that flourished in southern France during the 12th and 13th centuries, before being destroyed by a crusade launched by the Catholic Church. Through years of travel and study in the Pyrenees, Rahn develops a controversial theory. He believes that the Cathars may have protected a secret spiritual tradition, one that survived long after their persecution. Rahn publishes his ideas in the early 1930s, blending historical investigation with medieval legend. His work attracts a small but growing audience among those interested in Europe's forgotten religious past. Himmler is intrigued. Rahn's theories touch on something that had long fascinated him: a legend that had echoed through European literature for centuries. The story of a mysterious, sacred object. An object said to possess extraordinary spiritual power. The Holy Grail. In medieval legend, the story of the Holy Grail begins on the night of the Last Supper. As Christ sat with his disciples, he lifted a simple cup of wine and shared it among them, saying it was his blood, the blood of a new covenant. After the arrest and crucifixion of Christ, the legend takes a darker turn. One of his followers, often named Joseph of Arimathea, has said to have taken that same cup to the hill of Golgotha. As Christ hung on the cross, Joseph held the vessel beneath him. And into the cup fell the blood of the crucified Christ. Centuries later, according to medieval storytellers, the Grail vanished from the world. It would become the object of a great and mysterious quest, sought by the Knights of the Round Table in the legends of King Arthur. In medieval romances, the Grail is not easily found. It reveals itself only to those deemed spiritually worthy. Knights such as Sir Galahad, Sir Percival, and Sir Bors embark on perilous journeys in search of it. To approach the Grail, a knight must demonstrate purity, humility, and unwavering faith. It becomes the most sacred relic in Christendom, an object of divine grace, guarded by a hidden brotherhood, and sought by knights who must prove their purity to approach it. But Himmler rejects this interpretation. He studies alternative readings of the legend, especially those influenced by 19th century Romanticism and the operas of Richard Wagner. In Wagner's final opera, Parsifal, the Grail is recast as something older, mystical, tied to bloodline and purity. Himmler absorbs this version. He begins to argue that the Grail is not fundamentally Christian. Christianity merely appropriated a far older symbol. The Grail becomes, in his thinking, an artifact of an ancient Aryan civilization, a remnant of a superior culture that predates the Church. The legend reinforces a broader belief that the German people are direct descendants of the original Aryans, and that their ancient heritage has been obscured by centuries of religious and cultural corruption. But Himmler seeks tangible confirmation. And in 1935, he begins to formalize this search. With financial backing from the SS, Otto Rahn begins a series of expeditions into southern France. His investigations focus on the rugged landscape of the Pyrenees, where the Cathars had once resisted the armies of the Church. At the center of Rahn's search is the mountain fortress of Montségur Castle. Perched high above the surrounding valleys, Montségur served as one of the final strongholds of the Cathars during the Albigensian Crusade of the 13th century. In 1244, after months of siege, the fortress finally fell to crusading forces. More than 200 Cathar believers refused to renounce their faith and were burned alive at the foot of the mountain. Yet legends soon emerged supporting that something extraordinary had happened before the fortress surrendered. According to local tradition, several Cathars escaped the mountain under cover of darkness, carrying with them a mysterious treasure. For Rahn, this story hinted at something far more significant than lost gold or jewels. He speculated that the treasure might have been the Grail itself, preserved in secret by the Cathars and hidden somewhere within the remote caves and mountains of the Pyrenees. In the same year that Rahn's work begins attracting attention, Himmler establishes a new research organization within the SS. It is called the Ahnenerbe, officially the Ancestral Heritage Research and Teaching Society. Its mission is to investigate the ancient past of the so-called Aryan race. But under Himmler's direction, the organization soon becomes something more. It sponsors expeditions across Europe and beyond, searching for traces of a forgotten past. Himmler grows increasingly convinced that the Aryans did not originate in the regions identified by conventional scholarship. Instead, he begins to entertain far more radical possibilities. Perhaps the Aryans came from a lost northern homeland, a vanished civilization that once spread its influence across the world. These ideas begin to converge with an even older legend. A story that has fascinated scholars and dreamers for centuries. The lost city of Atlantis. The story begins more than 2,000 years ago. In the 4th century BCE, the Greek philosopher Plato describes a lost civilization in 2 of his dialogues, Timaeus and Critias. According to Plato, the tale is far older than Greece itself. He writes that the story was preserved by Egyptian priests, who passed it to the Athenian lawgiver Solon during his travels in Egypt centuries earlier. The priests told Solon of a powerful island civilization that had existed 9,000 years before their own time. Beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the narrow gateway now known as the Strait of Gibraltar, lay a vast island. Its name was Atlantis. Plato portrayed it as a prosperous island, home to a powerful and technologically advanced civilization. Its people possessed impressive engineering, military strength, and naval power, allowing them to dominate distant lands. Over time, however, their rulers grew corrupt and ambitious, abandoning the virtues they once possessed. Atlantis eventually sought to conquer the Mediterranean world, but was defeated by ancient Athens. Soon after, catastrophic earthquakes and floods struck, and in a single day and night, the island of Atlantis sank beneath the sea. Its civilization lost forever. For centuries, the story remained a philosophical myth, a cautionary tale about the rise and fall of civilizations. But by the late 19th and early 20th centuries, some writers began to reinterpret it. Within certain esoteric circles, Atlantis was no longer seen as an allegory, but as the last remains of a drowned continent that had once been home to a powerful and advanced civilization. For figures within the orbit of Heinrich Himmler, this reinterpretation carried enormous appeal. If such a civilization had existed, its traces must still remain. The most ambitious expedition takes place far from Europe. In 1938, a research mission is dispatched to Tibet, led by zoologist Ernst Schaefer. Within the SS, some believe Central Asia may hold clues to Aryan origins. If the Aryans once spread outward from a central homeland, perhaps traces of their culture still survive in remote regions. In Tibet, the team collect relics, manuscripts, and ritual objects from monasteries and villages. They photograph ceremonies, record sacred architecture, and measure skulls and facial features, attempting to map physical traits onto racial theories. Every symbol, object, and ritual is documented, in the belief that even the smallest detail might reveal a forgotten link to Aryan origins. Between 1935 and 1939, the Ahnenerbe grows in size and scope. Its work intersects with education, propaganda, and SS training programs. If the Aryan past can be demonstrated, even selectively, then the future can be justified. But as the decade draws to a close, the atmosphere in Europe is changing. Across the continent, tensions are rising. Soon the obsessions of men like Himmler will unfold not in libraries or archaeological expeditions, but on the battlefields of war that will engulf the world. When Germany marches into Poland, the world plunges into the Second World War. On the surface, the Nazi leadership appears focused on strategic dominance. But beneath the battlefield and political maneuvering, another pursuit continues. When war breaks out, the regime quietly sanctions a program of occult experimentation. Astrologers, psychics, and esoteric practitioners, some of whom had previously been arrested or monitored, are brought under SS control. They were tasked with producing symbolic and prophetic interpretations for Nazi leaders. These interpretations were drawn from astrological charts, celestial movements, and other forms of esoteric analysis. This effort exists on the margins of formal strategy. A fringe channel that survives because certain leaders believe it might reveal hidden forces or favorable timing. Among the occult figures co-opted into this shadow program is a Swiss astrologer named Karl Ernst Kraft. Kraft had been detained earlier in the war, but gained Himmler's attention after an astrological prediction he made in 1939 corresponded to an actual assassination attempt on Adolf Hitler. For Himmler, the coincidence is enough to order Kraft to produce astrological forecasts regarding the fate of the Reich and the timing of military events, even though astrology remains officially banned for the German public and independent practitioners. One event in particular stands out. In 1941, Hitler's deputy Rudolf Hess made a solo flight from Germany to Scotland without Hitler's knowledge, intending to open peace negotiations with Britain. However, upon landing near Glasgow, he is immediately arrested. He remains in British custody for the remainder of the war and beyond. What drove him to fly to Scotland remains debated among historians. Some evidence suggests he had a long-standing interest in astrology and esoteric belief. and that he was receptive to an astrological council that indicated 10th of May 1941 as a propitious date for a peace mission. Accounts from occult circles at the time note that astrologers close to Hesse believed there would be a rare planetary alignment on that day, interpreted by them as signaling major shifts in global affairs. Hesse took this as a confirmation that his peace initiative would succeed. Hitler was outraged. The actions of Hesse had exposed the fragile line between fantasy and political reality. In Hitler's view, these excursions into the mystical were no longer amusing curiosities. They were dangerous distractions that threatened to undermine the party's carefully controlled image and, more importantly, the ongoing war effort. In response, he ordered a sweeping wave of repression. Astrologers, clairvoyants, and esoteric practitioners were now targeted for removal. This campaign, later referred to informally as Action Hesse, was meticulous. Offices were raided, records confiscated, and public warnings issued. Hitler wanted to ensure that mystical beliefs could never distract the public or the leadership from the pressing demands of war, or become a source of confusion in an already fragile society. At the same time that Hitler was asserting control over the mystical fringe, cracks begin to appear in his relationship with Heinrich Himmler. Himmler's obsession, once tolerated as eccentric but harmless, was now a source of tension. A subtle but growing division within the highest levels of leadership. By the final years of the war, the defeat of the Axis powers became unavoidable. On the Eastern Front, Soviet forces advanced relentlessly, retaking cities that had been lost and pushing into the heart of Germany itself. In the West, Allied armies pressed forward after the Normandy landings, sweeping through France, Belgium, and the Low Countries. German cities burned under relentless bombing, supply lines collapsed, and morale broke. In these desperate final years, Himmler's obsession with the occult did not waver. Though the party had been forced into total war, he maintained private consultations with Wilhelm Wolff, a professional astrologer. Wolff prepared horoscopes, interpreted planetary alignments, and advised Himmler on auspicious dates for meetings, negotiations, and military movements. Some accounts suggest Himmler even hoped these consultations could guide him towards a safe surrender or provide insights into the future of the SS. His belief in hidden knowledge and cosmic influence had become, by this point, a private refuge, a secret ritual amidst the chaos of imminent defeat. But the tide of history could not be altered. Hitler died by suicide on April 30th, 1945, in his bunker beneath Berlin, choosing death over capture as Soviet troops encircled the city. Himmler attempted to flee north but was captured by Allied forces. Within days, he too took his own life, ending not only his life but the obsessive quest that had consumed him. The Third Reich, the party, and its machinery of myth and terror had been obliterated, leaving a nation devastated and a world in shock at the scale of destruction and horror unleashed. And far from the ruined cities, the symbolic heart of Himmler's mystical ambitions was abandoned. Wewelsburg Castle, his imagined Camelot, stood silent. His halls, once intended to host an elite circle of SS leaders and rituals tied to a mythic Germanic past, were left empty as the region collapsed. But what became of their quest for these ancient relics? Despite decades of expeditions, exhaustive documentation, and relentless study, the Nazis never found what they sought. The Holy Grail remained lost, shrouded in legend and scattered medieval references. Atlantis never rose from the depths, its location debated since the days of Plato. The legendary objects and civilizations that had motivated years of obsession proved to be as elusive as they had always been. And even after all these years, they retain a sense of mystery that continues to fascinate people today. The myths continue to beckon to those who wander. The door remains open, whispering the eternal question: what if some secrets of the past still lie just beyond the reach of proof, waiting to be discovered?